All right, hello and welcome to AppBuilder Office Hours. This is our third installment, and today we're going to be talking about 5 tips to build fast hybrid apps. And I'm going to go ahead and get this off. I'm joined today by my colleagues John Bristowe and Rob Lauer. You guys want to take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name's John. I'm in Sydney, Australia, which is the land down at the bottom of the map when you look at the map there. So a developer advocate with Telerik. I've been with the company for over 3 years. And yeah, really happy to be here to chat with you guys about performance and hybrid apps and all that great stuff.
Yeah, and I'm Rob Lauer. I am a product manager here at Telerik, and my duties focus on App Builder, App Manager, and the plugins marketplace. And I'm happy to be here as well.
John, what time is it there?
It is 5 a.m.
It is 5 a.m. This is how hardcore John is.
This is dedicated.
I'm a parent, so hours have no more meaning for me. So yeah, it's all good.
So we're talking hybrid performance today, and we do have something a little special for this episode. We are giving away a prize. We are giving away an Amazon Fire TV. So let me bring this back up here. So anyone that submitted a question for this show, which you can do if you head over to developer.telerik.com, we have a page for the show now under this community section, AppBuilder Office Hours. So anybody that submitted a question for the show here, we'll be answering a few of them live on air, and we'll be randomly picking one of those people that submitted a question to give away this fine Amazon Fire TV to. So stay tuned for that. We'll be tackling questions at the end of this. But I want to jump right back into our main topic here of building fast hybrid apps. We didn't necessarily pick what we thought were the 5 best tips, but just picked 5 things that you may not necessarily think of. And the first of those is avoiding the network, which I think this one, I remember when we were talking about this, John, you were saying that you think this is kind of common knowledge before, but we wanted to include this just because it's so important to, and a lot of people don't necessarily know this.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think if you've been in the web dev space for a while, one of the things you know is just every time you do an HTTP request response transaction, if you will, that takes into account all kinds of things like latency, and there's a perceived performance hit that you'll take with that because obviously when users are spent waiting for your app to load, they're going to see that as sort of a performance issue. So trying to avoid the network is important. In the context of hybrid mobile apps, this becomes a little bit more nuanced now because with apps now you have the ability, if you so choose, to package up your apps when you push them out to the App Store. And so you have to think a little bit strategically about, what is some of the content that I want to pull dynamically versus what is some of the content that I want to put into the app package and make available. It's always good to take a hit up front because there's no perceived performance there. The only perceived performance that you might encounter as a user is, wow, this is a big app, so I'll have to wait for it to download. That's your one and only time where I think taking as much network time as you need is probably acceptable from a user's perspective. That is, when a user goes to download an app, they really don't say, you don't hear a lot of feedback because I know this both empirically and also by just talking to other folks. People don't really care too much about how long it takes an app to download. They really do care, though, how long it takes to maybe load a portion of the page or things like that. So thinking strategically about, can I push some of this into the app package is really going to be a concern there. But I don't know if you see this, Rob, but for me, I try and encourage developers to try and embed as much stuff as they can up front because that's the only time you can.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think the one thing I would add to that is that not only being part of the application package itself, but if you need to download any assets when the app starts up for the first time, when you're initializing the app, I think that's acceptable as well. If you give some kind of like loading indication, I think users are okay with that, but like you said, it comes down to if I'm transitioning between views and there's some kind of lag there due to some network access, that's a killer. Users will dump your app amazingly quickly if you do that.
Yeah.
Right.
And like in terms of specifics, it's like things like using a CDN, which are a fairly common web development practice, but it's something you probably don't want to do. I mean, it's kind of dependent on the circumstance, but let's say you just need jQuery or Bootstrap or whatever the library is. It's almost always going to be advantageous to just toss that in the app package. It's a tiny file. I mean, jQuery is like 30, 40K, whatever. It's nothing
Yeah.
in your app package, whereas that network trip going after the user could be on rural network, have to jump out to some radio tower and make the crazy round trip just to get that 30K. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the other issues, of course, is the fact that with devices, you have to take into account battery life. And so one of the things that comes into play, obviously, is anytime you touch the radio, you're chewing up battery. It's a huge battery killer. And so you have to be cognizant of that. One of the things you don't want to see, obviously, with your app is hey, on a review, hey, my battery is draining because this app is consuming too much network or screen or whatever. Yeah, using the radio is an absolute killer in terms of battery life. So you have to take that into account. You do mention a good part of this discussion, TJ, which is obviously the nuances of network connections on a mobile device. The networks themselves are different. You're sort of always roaming. The way the situation in terms of like what towers you're connecting to and the latency is dramatically exacerbated when you're talking mobile networks because there's a lot of latency in mobile networks.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add to that, 2 or 3 years ago when I was at the University of Wisconsin before I came to Telerik, and one of my primary projects was working on the game day mobile app for the UW athletics team here. And what was interesting is one of the first requirements that came out of that was that the fact that the app had to work offline because most of the app users were using the app we were creating inside of our stadiums, which if any of you have tried to use a mobile device in a stadium, you realize that, I mean, the network gets saturated so quickly that if we were to create an app that required network access, it would be unusable. So there's interesting requirements that come up when you're designing an app. So that's one thing I would suggest to people is think about the offline experience first instead of last.
Yeah, definitely.
How many people does Badger Stadium seat?
Oh, it's got to be 70,000 something.
70,000.
It's Camp Randall, TJ. Come on.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, you're definitely right there. I mean, like I've been to events myself where you'll have full bars and absolutely no bandwidth, and that's not just exclusive to sporting events. Anytime you go into a central business district or downtown area on the train, for example, at 9 a.m., it's the same situation all the time. Full bars, no bandwidth. So you definitely have to be cognizant of that. So using offline storage is going to help a great deal there. And what's interesting is that the innovations that are coming on board relative to networking are kind of interesting. So recently, Apple introduced in part of its stack the ability to do peer-to-peer networking. Now, the ramifications of that are interesting because you're using the same radio, but you're leveraging sort of other nodes around you for networking purposes. And one of the applications I saw that was implemented using this was a sort of chat application. So in the instance that you described, Rob, where you're at a stadium and you have no bandwidth at all, and you use a peer network, for example, that might get around that issue because now the only thing you really might be interested in that situation is I want to talk to other people saying, hey, did you check out that play, or can you believe the ref made that call? And so using a sort of peer network would get around that issue. So it's just to be a little bit smarter about when and where you're going to use networks.
Yeah, the last thing I want to mention about the offline stuff is Kendo UI Mobile actually added some helper functionality to help implement that sort of stuff. And if you haven't played with it before, it's kind of slick. If you've used Kendo UI Mobile before, you know that basically you define how your data works through Kendo UI data sources, which is kind of what I have defined here. And to add the offline stuff, all you really need to do is add a property that tells it where to store that information when the device goes offline. So it actually uses the HTML5 local storage API by default to store your data. And then when you come back online, there's a method that you can call to basically sync up your front end, anything that happened while you're offline, to send those requests, sequentially send those up to the server. So if you haven't before, I've actually spent some time last week or so playing around with this, and it's quite slick. So if you haven't looked at that before, it's worth checking out.
And another resource would be, I guess, Ilya Grigorik, who spends an enormous amount of time looking at these sorts of things. So yeah, he's got a blog which you can check out.
I can never, I can't spell his name though.
I'll always misspell it here. So
it's high performance.
So
yeah.
Yeah. So Ilya talks a lot. He's obviously one of the top minds on this sort of subject at Google, and so he spends a lot of time talking about this. He's got some great presentations that go into detail about what you should think about in terms of that, and he really does break it down quite a bit in terms of what actually happens when you make an HTTP request over a mobile network. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and when you start to see how much latency there is, it's actually pretty crazy. He did write a blog post that talks a little bit about that. So he has statistics and all sorts of great little things and charts that show you just how long it will take to do some of these things. So definitely a great resource there.
All right, so I think I'm going to move us on to number 2 here, which, oops, wrong direction, is using a fast web view. Rob, do you want to explain a little bit about what this means?
Yeah, so, well, one way to look at this is from the perspective of iOS. And now when iOS 8 was released, one thing that Apple released with this version of iOS was WK WebView, which stands for WebKit WebView. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's a new modern WebView. And the primary advantage of this WebView is accessing it's called the Nitro JavaScript rendering engine, which provides something like 2 to 3 times faster JavaScript compilation and processing than the standard WebView that you're using right now with Cordova. So the first thing we all think of is, well, great, when iOS 8 is released, we're all going to start using the WK WebView. Unfortunately, there's a bug that came up in, I think, the beta 2 of iOS 8 that prevented Cordova from explicitly addressing the WK WebView. Since then, however, where there's a couple of plugins that have showed up, Cordova plugins that have showed up, to actually allow you to access this web view. So the easiest way for me to put this is using a faster web view is going to provide a really easy way to increase the performance of your app. But remember that it really focuses mostly on JavaScript when we're talking about iOS. Now, if we start talking about Android, it gets a little bit different because working backwards from Android 5, if we look at Lollipop, for instance, that ships with now a self-updating web view. So everybody on Android 5 and up, in theory, is always going to be set, right? They're always going to have the latest Chrome web view. They're going to have the latest, HTML5 goodies and really great performance. Back to 4.4. 4.4 was amazing for us hybrid developers too because we were able to. They started shipping. I think it was something Chrome 30 or something was shipped in 4.4. The problem with that, though, is that it was not self-updating. So everybody on 4.4, I think, is stuck on that version, which for right now isn't the end of the world, but it's, eventually it will be a liability. Now, looking back, sorry, do you have something, TJ?
I was just going to say, and the problem, too, with Android is that because there's like 10,000 versions of Android, that depending on who your OEM is, what kind of device you have, there's a good chance you're stuck indefinitely on the Android version you have. So I was just looking at the current numbers because Android kind of maintains a pretty good usage share numbers on their site. And according to them, KitKat, so 4.4 is now up to 34%. And apparently they don't have numbers on Lollipop yet, but I would guess it's a tiny, tiny fraction.
Probably pretty darn small, yeah, unfortunately. So yeah, Android developers, we've been struggling this since day one in hybrid, especially when you get pre 4.4. That's when you're talking about stock Android web view. Pretty bad performance. I will say one thing: it makes you a better developer, right? Because you have to look at every single micro optimization possible. But the solution actually that there is coming out now, there are alternative web views for Android that you can use. A popular one is Crosswalk, which I think is sponsored by Intel. And there are some other ones. There's also a Mozilla web view, I think, that the Cordova team is working on implementing as well. And something that a lot of people may not realize, and I hope I'm getting this right, but I think with Cordova 4.0, which is the next major release of Cordova, web views are going to be pluggable, so you'll be able to plug in whatever web view you want. And now following that, since I'm the AppBuilder product manager, I should know about this. And in our AppBuilder roadmap, this is a high priority for us. So we've had people complain, like, why can't I access, Crosswalker, WK WebView, and AppBuilder? I hear you. I hear your pain. And we are actively working on this, and we will have support for WK WebView in early 2015, very early 2015. And we are actively, we're paying attention to what Cordova is doing. We're going to have support for alternative web views as well. So that's all coming as part of AppBuilder.
Well, and the thing that I think is so cool about it is it's like a drop-in thing, because since really, I mean, there are API differences between the WebView. Like, so if you're using a more modern Chromium version, there's going to be newer APIs. But for the most part, it's pretty much you just target a different web view and you just automatically get any performance benefits that are there.
Yes, I'm a very lazy developer, and anything I can do to just plug something in and just have it magically work, that I'm going to sign up for that.
So keep an eye out for both of those coming to AppBuilder relatively soon, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, as far as the WK WebView plugin goes, we do have a Cordova plugin ready to go. It will be published on our plugins marketplace. If you haven't been there, go to plugins.telerik.com. It will be there. I don't want to. Well, I'll say it. I'll commit. January, sometime in January.
Nice. Like it.
Now it's official.
Yep. You heard it here, folks. That's great. Right.
Very cool. So we've got a good transition here, because tip number 3, speaking of the plugins marketplace, is to use native code where applicable. And this is really getting at Cordova plugins and using Cordova plugins where they make sense.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, obviously, native code will run really, really well on the native device. So a lot of times you want to think strategically about where you want to use the various aspects of the phone and its performance to your app. So plugins help in a great way there. So they will defer control over to native code. And I think a lot of people, once they start to see how the sausage is made underneath the covers, they start to realize, actually, this is nothing. This is not a daunting task. You can simply just write these plugins yourself and start utilizing native aspects of SDKs or the APIs themselves directly, if you so choose. So this is a very popular technique amongst hybrid developers. There's a number of apps that have been written this way, and in using that same sort of flavor, you can get some pretty interesting solutions written. So one example might be, for example, if you're writing a hybrid app and you want to utilize something like media in the context of the app itself. So as you might know, displaying things like live video stream or things of that nature can be a daunting challenge with things like HTML5 and other APIs we have at our disposal. So using layering or using sections of your app, designating sections of your app to be native versus hybrid, that's the nature of the hybrid game, which is you use both web and native in concert. So in some respects, it will help just getting around some of the API limitations of HTML5. But in other instances, it can be a real benefit in terms of where you want to go in terms of your app performance. So it's something you have to think very strategically about, but it is something you can definitely do.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize that when you think of Cordova or PhoneGap or AppBuilder, you tend to think of things like the camera or the accelerometer, but
right.
I think a lot of people don't know that you really have arbitrary access to any native API. You just need a plugin. You either need to find a plugin that does it or to write a plugin yourself that does it. So if you run into some performance problem with hybrid, like with media, like John said, or with anything for that matter, you could just write a plugin to get at the native APIs to do it for you.
Yeah, there's an old refrain that I remember way back in the day, which is when developers are faced with a challenge or problem, do we just give up? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, that's it, we can't do it? No, we do as God intended. We hack. And so in this instance, some people might see this as a bit of a hack. It's just a way of getting around the limitations. And so this is definitely an approach I would advocate, and one that you could take to heart, basically, in your app development. And it will help in certain respects. So I know that if you're wanting to leverage newer APIs, you certainly have to go this route. But in terms of performance, I mean, there are some certain cases where it really doesn't make too much sense. But yeah, a lot of cases it can really help. So some examples might be, for example, in terms of where you may want to go native, utilizing some of the networking, for example. You know, if you want to go beyond just HTTP requests via AJAX or what have you, you know, there are substacks that you could use. The camera app also is not so much a performance issue, but rather how you use the camera itself. So the camera API through Cordova is fine. The problem is a lot of people want to use the app in certain contexts, in certain ways. So if you look at some of the camera apps that are available today, they're using the app in concert with other controls on the screen. You can't really do that with Cordova app, the plugin itself, as such, in a very rich way. It's basically, you know, do you want to use the camera? Yes. Okay, here's the camera full screen. It's not really integrated nicely within the confines of your app. So there are going to be some issues there. And so getting around those issues might help if you were to write a little bit of native code, for example, to designate a section of the screen to do that. So yeah, definitely some scenarios that you can consider there.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention one more here, the spinner plugin. That, again, you can find on plugins.telerik.com, but this one's brand new, right, Rob? This was recently added.
Yeah, we just released this last week, so it allows you to show a native loading indicator or a spinner for iOS, Android, and Windows Phone.
Yeah, I played with this for a minute. I mean, it just takes a second. Like, you need one command here. Like, if you're just using Cordova, it's just a single command you can add. Same thing with like the AppBuilder CLI, and it's just basically like spinner.show and spinner.hide, and you can use these type things. So I find that I need these things all the time, and that the just silly things like in a hybrid app, getting an animated GIF to work right can sometimes be like way more of a hassle than you think it should be.
Yeah, it doesn't look nice either. You know, sometimes it takes a second or two to load, and it's like, ugh, you know, and it just doesn't look nice. So.
Yep. So I mean, this one I was super excited about just because it's so simple. Like, it's a trivial API, just show and hide, and it's the situation that I don't know of many apps that don't need a loading indicator at some point. So.
The only other one I was
going to performance. So there you go.
Yeah.
The one other thing I want to point out, since you're on the marketplace now, and I know you guys have talked about this in the past, but our native page transitions plugin is another pretty popular one. And since we're really talking about perceived performance, right, we care what our users are experiencing when they're using our apps. And so if you haven't seen this plugin before, this app allows you to tap into sort of native OS transitions between your views. So you don't get that jankiness you sometimes see, especially on older Android devices. You know, that's a really obvious use case here. So it's sort of a plugin. I mean, it is a plugin, but should it say a drop-in utility to take advantage of native page transitions. And there are, in fact, there is literally a drop-in adapter for Kendo UI that you can, if you're using Kendo UI to develop your app. Yeah, TJ's got the instructions right there. So all you do is drop that in your app, and it magically takes over all those Kendo UI transitions to make them native.
Maybe we should take a second to talk a little bit about jank and what that really means in the confines of a hybrid app. So jank is kind of what you'll see when you have, in the traditional sense, in the web sense, it's where you'll see less than optimal performance in terms of drawing things to the screen. So this is typically where you'll fall under that sort of 60 frames per second threshold. And when you go to scroll or you see redraw events, the app doesn't really feel all that silky smooth. And so, as Rob rightly pointed out, it's a perceived performance issue. And so one of the things that you can do to try and help with that, to help users feel like this is a silky, buttery smooth, whatever adjective you want to inject, experience, is to try and eliminate those sort of bottlenecks in your code that produce jank. So there you go.
Yep, and toss up a spinner while those things are up, or to help.
that's like the biggest cop out there is in development. You know, just hang on a second. I mean, we borrowed that from the game developers of old, right? Remember in the 80s and 90s, they'd be like loading and be waiting for whatever game, King's Quest,
I wouldn't even say of old. Like modern games are even worse
Yeah, I
than
guess.
that.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm thinking of the days when I had 5.25 floppies and it'd be like, please insert disk 3. It's just waiting, That's kind of like your Webview, right? It's like, please wait. I'm loading a new view. So. And I've just dated myself how old I am.
all right. So that takes us to tip number 4, which is keep an eye on the state of the art. And John, I know that's one you wanted to talk about, so you want to take this one to start?
Yeah, so it wasn't just recently that Google held its Chrome Developer Summit, and in that conference, they did a recap of all the stuff they had announced, including auto-updating web views and things like that. These are things that I come across quite frequently online, but when I go to talk to developers inside companies and organizations, it's unfortunate that a lot of developers aren't maintaining they're keeping an eye on the ball, so to speak. They're just very heads down and focused on building something quickly, and that's fine. I mean, like, rightly so, they should. But at the same time, there's a lot of innovation going on at Google, at Mozilla, obviously, at Microsoft, that they're trying to push the state of the art, and they're trying to move the web forward. And Rob mentioned this with WK Webview is one example. Auto-updating web views is another. Just keeping an eye on things like canIuse.com and other APIs, newer APIs that are coming up all the time. This is very important, especially in the context of high-performant hybrid apps, because a lot of times things that we have to fight against, a lot of those problems, the vendors are very much aware of these problems, right? It's not like they're just sitting in the corner and just hoping to push phone units. They obviously care a great deal about developers too, and so they want to obviously push that ahead. And if you look at the videos which are on YouTube now of the Chrome Developer Summit, you can see where a lot of the innovation is going, and a lot of that innovation, especially at Google, is focused on performance. So they are very, very cognizant of performance now.
Yeah, and the other thing too is for hybrid apps, it's a bit different of a situation than web apps in that you have less of a deploy target, right? Like, you're not deploying to the whole web. You're deploying to, say, like Android devices and iOS devices. So there's a good chance you're able to use some of that state-of-the-art stuff before you're able to use it in your web apps, especially if you have to support older browsers for those web apps. And especially, let's say you're developing a Android app for use just within your company. Well, if like your company's phones that they're being distributed are a certain Android version, then those APIs are fine for you to use. So you have a lot more opportunity.
Yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that's going on there. Like the big push that I'm seeing these days is around WebRTC, and there's a lot of innovation going on there because that's sort of like it's a big rock that developers are trying to tackle, because WebRTC obviously is pretty sexy in the mobile context for developers, and so that's just another example. Now, obviously, it doesn't really speak too much to performance per se. I mean, it can certainly help in terms of navigating network topologies and figuring out, who should I stream first and how do I sort that all out? And obviously that's where WebRTC helps. You wouldn't want to implement that yourself. But those are examples of state-of-the-art where keeping an eye on where there's a lot of innovation being done is very important and should be done quite diligently. You should keep up with the announcements that are coming down. Also, keep aware of what new devices are coming down, because those could be the next major platforms you'll have to support. As you and I know, TJ and Rob, what's current today is outdated within 6, 8, 9 months later. So.
Well, and even like the Webview stuff that we talked about earlier would fall into this bucket as well, like knowing that WK Webview is out there and jumping on the plugin when it becomes available, or looking into Crosswalk and how you could use it. All of these type things kind of this mobile space evolves so fast that it's important to keep up on what's going on.
Yeah, this is maybe a little bit off topic too, but talking about keeping an eye on the state of the art. We're 2015. A lot of 2015 is going to be about wearables, right? And this first gen of wearables that we're seeing right now, Apple Watch, and the Android devices, the Moto 360s, that kind of thing, and what that's going to mean for hybrid developers, because there isn't generally a Webview running on these devices. So it's not going to be like we're developing apps for a watch. They're usually partnered with a tablet or a phone device. And
Right.
I realize I'm getting off topic of performance here, but it's something, something of course we're very aware of, and we're looking at how we can integrate plugin based solutions for these kind of things. So, but it's something we all need to keep an eye on.
The best analogy I've made is my father's a doctor. He's a radiologist, and so his job is to sit in front of a screen with X-rays and MRIs and stuff, and look internally into people's bodies and tell them, this is, you unfortunately have this cancer, or here's the problem with your leg, or what have you. And the analogy I tried to make to him is, our industry moves so fast, innovates so quickly, that if I were a doctor and the patients coming in were the mobile apps or whatever the innovations going on, it would be akin to sitting there and looking at an X-ray of a man with now 10 arms or 2 heads or 8 livers, and so that's kind of where things are at. And so it behooves you as a developer to keep up with what's going on there, because not only will it help in those situations where new innovations come out, but they'll also help in terms of performance, especially when things like new APIs or techniques are established, and can really help tackle some of those problems.
Very cool. All right, so we've been about a half hour now, so I want to move on to the last one, and this is probably what I might consider the most important of them, and that is to manage the DOM. The DOM being the notorious bottleneck for pretty much a lot of web things, and I think in the last few years we've seen a lot of frameworks come out to kind of recognize this problem and to work around it. And so you have things like React's the first framework that comes to mind for me.
Yep.
And React, for anyone not familiar, React has this concept of a virtual DOM, which basically what it does at a very high level is whenever you need to make a change to your view, say like you have this view, you're changing the name or something that displays in it, React intelligently figures out what is essentially the minimum number or the smallest number of changes it needs to make to the DOM to reflect that change live to the user, and does that for you automatically.
Yeah.
With the idea being that the DOM is slow, the DOM is often the cause of the jankiness we talked about before, or the perceived slowness, so that if you can figure out how to touch the DOM as little as possible, it's going to make your app perceived or actually be faster.
Yeah, it's definitely something you want to target in terms of hybrid app performance. This is super critical. And as you mentioned, there are frameworks to help address this problem. But you certainly want to be super aware of what's actually happening underneath the Komodo, if you will, because obviously when you're doing updates to a page, there's a lot of repainting going on. Now, fortunately, you can debug this quite easily. There are some great dev tools out there that you can use to help try to recognize, identify, and help fix this problem, to try and hit that 60 frames per second sort of peak that we all aspire to. So I know that Chrome's got some great tools to show you repaints. Firefox has some great tools to show that as well. But managing the DOM also can creep out in other ways. Like certainly, like I've seen problems with the DOM in a lot of different contexts. Kind of eke out problems that normally would just be isolated. So it's definitely something that you need to be cognizant of and be very aware of. Now, there's a whole set of APIs that will, potentially cause reflows or repaints on your page that can kill your perceived performance, and so you got to be aware of those things. There's more than enough resources out there. If you do a simple Google search or whatever for janky and DOM management and things like that, you'll find all those resources. I believe there's like about 14 or 30 or so APIs that you shouldn't really try and touch if you're doing updates to the page, for example. I know that Paul Irish has done a huge amount of video content on YouTube talking about this problem, so something definitely to take a look at. But managing the DOM definitely something that, I mean, it speaks to the problems we've had on the website. So there's no reason why they wouldn't also be problems on the hybrid side, because you're basically dealing with the same problem.
And I think this, like, at least I see this most often in hybrid in terms of lists, just because mobile apps tend to have lists a lot, and especially big lists, like think like a Twitter-like app, and that's like or any sort of endless scroll interaction or like pull to refresh type interaction. And a lot of times people have these performance issues when they build this list and they throw like 10,000 things in there and then wonder why their app is slow. Because the browser can only has the memory and only has the capacity to handle so much of that for you. So I know different frameworks do different things. I was just looking up. Kendo UI Mobile has this has a list view widget that has basically that same concept of a virtual DOM built into it. If you look up the virtual page size option, basically it'll manage that DOM for you. So if you build a list with say 10,000 items, it'll intelligently only throw like 20 or 30, or well, that's what the option configures. How many are actually in the list at one time, and then it kind of shuffles the DOM for you intelligently as you do it.
And it's a classic computer science problem. It's the sliding window sort of view of you don't need to display in the DOM stuff that you can't see. So there's APIs that can also tell you this. You've got things like Page Visibility API and other things like that. If you want to go that hands-on, you can definitely go that route.
Yep, and Ionic has something like that as well. I don't know the specifics of the Ionic implementation, but I know they have something that works very similarly to kind of manage what's shown in there.
Yeah, most definitely.
All right, I'm just getting the questions up because I think that's all we have for the main tips. Anything you guys want to add before we get into the questions?
You know, one other related tip when you started talking about frameworks and everything, one thing I wanted to just point out again, another advantage you get out of using an existing mobile framework, you know, something like Kendo UI or Ionic, along with the core JavaScript side of things, is the CSS that comes with it. And like with Kendo UI and Ionic they both ship with these flat themes. And I know that with Kendo UI specifically, when we shipped our flat theme, which must have been a year and a half ago, maybe, something like that.
Sounds about right.
When we did that, actually, our engineering team came up with some metrics and showed that in general we saw. I hope I'm remembering this right, but I think it was like a 30% increase in speed across devices at the time. So you know, considering things like that, it's significant. And granted, a lot of people are getting away from, you know, using gradients, which will slow things down anyway. But it's always something to keep in mind.
I gotta have my box shadows, man. I gotta have Yeah, definitely. I think you know, with Google's approach towards material design, certainly Microsoft's been in that space with Metro for a long time. This sort of just consistent one color to rule them all sort of approach, and then keep things flat and tidy, I think helps a great deal. And you wouldn't think, you wouldn't think that, I've got this Snapdragon device, or I've got 28,000 cores, and it slows down because I'm using a gradient. But that's where I think CSS can help. Because don't forget, CSS will in some respects be a lot more performant because you're targeting now the GPU. A lot of that stuff can be shuffled off to the GPU, whereas with JavaScript you're still beholden in many ways to the CPU. So yeah, definitely trying to use CSS and other aspects like that. WebGL is a good candidate as well. Or Canvas. Those are great drawing APIs. Canvas especially. If you're doing anything with 2D and you're trying to animate something, you can use CSS animations. That's great. But Canvas is it's a dirt simple API, and a lot of that stuff will target the GPU, so it'll become super performant.
Indeed.
Yeah, we could talk more about this. You could talk about Famous, another framework that leverages the same concept. Yeah. I mean, it gets a little scary. It gets a little scary after a while. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen, but like I go on CodePen once in a while, and the examples that are there of how to do X, Y, and Z with just CSS, it's a little daunting when you look at it. Like certainly the rules, and you look at the CSS, it's pretty complicated. You've got all these like pseudo elements and things and actions. It can be a bit daunting, but it does matter and it does help.
Yeah, like the people that draw Homer Simpson and South Park characters and CSS and such. like the crazy things like that too. It can be very
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always blown away by some of the examples that are there. People do great examples of like turning the hamburger icon and animating it in such a way that it will flow out a menu. It's such a trivial thing, but to get that right and to make it leverage the GPU and to make it look that sort of buttery smooth 60 frames per second sort of effect, you can do a lot of that with CSS and transitions and animations. And the great thing is it just, as I said, it leverages the GPU, so it's going to go as fast as it can.
All right. Well, I'm going to transition into the questions here so we can keep this down to like 45 minutes and an hour, because we could talk about performance all day, I'm sure. So the first question, I've picked out 4 of them to read on the air, and for other questions, make sure to check TDN, developer.telerik.com. We'll be announcing after this show the winner of the Fire TV, and we'll be summarizing these questions as well. So the first question is from Tim Benson. The question is, can you explain what makes AppBuilder the best tool for building Cordova hybrid apps, specifically in areas of speed, likeness to native apps on the target platforms, and the simplicity of app production?
I love that question because it sounds like, AppBuilder, best or great IDE or the greatest IDE. It's a very leading question. Anyways, Rob, I'll defer to you since you're the PM.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. It's a huge question, and really, I'm trying to think of how I can answer it really quickly. Really, I guess I like to think of AppBuilder as sort of the hub and a hub and spoke model of what the Telerik platform represents. It is part of a whole integrated suite of products that let you take your app from idea to production. I mean, I know that sounds like a marketing line, but it really is true. It allows you to integrate with analytics and our backend services. So as far as developer productivity, it's really unmatched. And even within AppBuilder, we have things like we have simulators, we have access to your native emulators, you have access to all of the debugging tools that you're used to using, the Chrome Dev tools, as well as publishing to the app stores. I mean, we try and come up with like everything that makes you more productive. And when you combine that with a framework like Kendo UI, which does give you either that adaptive rendering, like I think Tim kind of mentioned, the likeness to native apps. So you can get that native render or adaptive rendering, sorry, or you can go with like a generic flat UI if you want to as well that we already talked about. So really, we have this, what is good alone or no great. Better to get, what is it? Great alone, better together. I think that's what
I think
it is.
that's right. Yeah.
I know it's kind of corny and everything, but it is true. I mean, it's what our products are meant to do. So.
Yeah, I think based on my usage of AppBuilder, there's 2 real sweet spots for AppBuilder. One, the CLI. CLI is just, it's sort of like riding without training wheels. It's a little daunting at first for some folks, but once you get the hang of it, you're off to the races. And surprisingly, secondly, is integration with Visual Studio. I think Visual Studio plus AppBuilder is awesome. And I do a lot of JavaScript work these days, but back in my previous life when I was at Microsoft, I was obviously spending most of my, if not all my time in Visual Studio and Outlook, deleting email and all that. But the combination of AppBuilder plus Visual Studio is awesome. And the reason for it is obviously self-explanatory. Visual Studio is a great IDE, probably the best IDE out there. And then AppBuilder has all these sort of complementary tools, and it doesn't take over the environment. It just annotates everything that's there, and you can combine that with things like Web Essentials and things like that to become super productive. But if you're taking a look at it, obviously the first approach that most people take is through the web. So we have the web client. But definitely check out the CLI. And then secondly, if you're doing anything with Visual Studio, which a lot of folks are, definitely look at the integration there. It's available through the marketplace.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that too is if you haven't written any JavaScript in Visual Studio in a while, you should take another look because it's gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. So. Yeah,
definitely. So, right. Great, very leading question. I love it. What makes it the best?
So the next question is, I'm going to slaughter this name, but from Vivek Vishwakarma.
All right, we'll leave it there. That's good.
Okay, Vivek. Yes. Yeah. UI and UX are major parts of an app. People will only open the app a second time if it provides something to engage with. How flexible is AppBuilder for smooth transitions and animations for all the platforms? I am working on Xamarin, and it is limiting me when it comes to UI and UX. How are you going to tackle this? So I think part of this is when it talks about transitions and animations and such, the native page transitions plugin comes to mind for me first and foremost. Like AppBuilder at least from a UI framework side, AppBuilder doesn't care what UI framework you use, so you could use Candy Mobile, Ionic, whatever, and those frameworks all have different transitions that are built into them. But what the native page transitions plugin does is it says, well, when those aren't enough, if you really need silky smooth animations, then that plugin lets you tie into essentially the native iOS and Android animations or transitions, that is, the transition between your views and such.
Yeah, I think here we have a good story. I think the story is getting better, particularly with things like Screen Builder, which you can sign up for the beta. So if you go to telerik.com/screenbuilder, this will certainly help you. I think I think that's a solution that I think quite honestly the industry has been missing, particularly on the hybrid side since forever. I don't think we really have a great solution there yet from anyone that I've seen. And even Xamarin falls down in terms of this. Like Xamarin forms itself, it does a reasonable job, but it's still not there with other sort of paradigms, if you will. I think the place that everyone wants to get to in terms of UX and UI, in terms of that development, and I hate to say it, but is like the VB6 style type of development where drag, click, and away you go. I don't advocate that. Some of my friends would argue that I do. I don't, but there's an old meme of me saying I did it all without a line of code. There's something to be said about that. I think Screen Builder is going to help. I think there's definitely some innovation there that I'm pretty excited about. But maybe Rob, you can talk a little bit more about this.
So about what, Screen Builder in particular?
Well, just in terms of the innovation there, I haven't seen anything in the industry yet that is addressing this problem head on well. I've seen some solutions that do a reasonable job, but nothing that really blows it out of the water.
Yeah, I mean, I see new solutions that seem to come out every month or so, and nobody really gets it quite right, and it leads to this uncanny valley almost of like, I see a lot of things that are great demo features, demo apps, but when you actually get into a practical solution, it tends to not come through.
Yeah, drag and drop.
Bring it back to like Ionic, for example. They've got their creator solution now, I guess, as an example. So.
Yeah, I find that all drag and drop tools tend to fall into that camp. I don't know. I've iOS, the storyboarding that's like for native iOS apps, I find is halfway decent, but even that tends to break down when you started to get into really complex stuff. So
yeah, it's hard because you're trying to map that whole idea of storyboarding is not an easy thing to design a tool for, and because there's so much nuance associated with a static sort of state of an application. And believe me, if people had gotten this correct, they would have done so years ago. It's not an easy thing to do. And how do you quantify, something that's a transition in a static tool? Because a lot of these ones are static. I'm going from here to here, and the only time it actually becomes interactive is when you actually compile the thing. So, it's one of those things where you can have live instances, certainly, but I think that goes above and beyond now a UX UI tool. You're now talking about you have to have some code running there to kind of quantify some of those things. So, but visually representing those things is a real problem. Like, how do you do that? Do you use annotations? Do you show a temporary state? It's a hard problem.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. We have a question from Survey Hermans. How do I start an Ionic project when using the AppBuilder platform in the browser? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's nothing about using AppBuilder limits you to any one particular framework. Granted, we provide you getting started templates, and our quick start tutorials all focus on Kendo UI, right? But there's nothing preventing you from using Ionic, jQuery Mobile, what have you, and you actually use that probably the easiest way to do that is with our Bower integration. And I know Bower, either you love it or you hate it, but it's part of our new package manager inside all of the AppBuilder clients. All you have to do is do a quick search for Ionic and then say install, and it'll install Ionic for you to get you up and running.
Yep.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty easy answer. You can do it today. So
yeah.
I'm not sure what I can add there.
Yeah, if you go to the docs and like docs.telerik.com and if you just search for Bower, it's pretty easy and it's a pretty well documented way of doing it. So check that out. And then the last question is from our colleague Gabe. Gabe has a question about PhoneGap plugins. I understand there are PhoneGap plugins that coax native performance out of web technologies, but what is being done officially in the new HTML, JavaScript, CSS specs, and by platform vendors to eliminate the need for plugins altogether?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I think there's a lot of moving parts and pieces that associate to that question. I think we on our side are doing some interesting things. I'm very excited about NativeScript, for example, which is sort of it's like a JavaScript proxy, JavaScript to native proxy, if you will. It allows you to call directly to device platform APIs via JavaScript and marshals parameters and things like that. So that's going to help address some of those issues that typically tend to crop up with plugins. But let's be clear. I mean, one of the major reasons why plugins can be a problem is because there's really two things that occur when you use plugins. One, the plugin itself is very device oriented. What I mean by that is it's a very iOS, for example, plugin. Like it only works on iOS. The other problem that can creep out is obviously versioning. So iOS 8 comes out, or Lollipop, or Candy Stick, or whatever Google wants to call their next version, and now there's these new APIs that you can't access, or the plugin itself is incompatible. Versioning can be another issue as well. So those are the two main sort of things that I see when people deal with plugins. Certainly, stale plugins are really frustrating, particularly when wanting to address a new platform. So there are ways in which to get around some of those problems. A lot of time people just wait and they just deal with it. But I think innovations like NativeScript can help. I know that it's something that the plugin integration is a very simple model, right? You've got one API called exec. Everything gets funneled through there. It's like that sort of scene where you see those 1950s photos of everyone trying to shove. Let's get as many people as we can into this phone booth or bus, and you see everyone kind of like cramped up against the glass and stuff. That's very analogous to what happens with the plugin, where you have this exec API that you just call into. You shove all your parameters in there, and you basically push control over to the plugin, and then the plugin does its work, and then maybe reverts control back. It's not the nicest model in some respects. I understand why they do it. I mean, this is the problem. I could go off on a rant here and talk about COM, for example, and threading apartments and contexts and things like that. That transitioning from one context to another context, abstractly, is a hard problem. You have a lot. It's like you're taking the red pill of the matrix and injecting yourself into the matrix, and now you have a different world and different parameters. That's the exact same model we have there. So there are issues to contend with in terms of plugins, but I think things like NativeScript might help there.
Well, and part of Gabe's question is, I mean, when PhoneGap came out, they notoriously said that their mission is to basically not exist. That they are doing what the web doesn't do. And so I think we've already talked about some of the things when we were talking about keep an eye on the latest and greatest, things like WebRTC to make video better on the web, to make like two-way communication possible through the web. There's things like service workers, which Google's been really promoting lately, that should allow for things like better offline control for push notifications from the web without needing to use a plugin as well.
Yeah, service workers are going to be great. I mean, they're going to give you the control you never had for things like caching. The problem we always had with caching was that it was sort of a all or nothing sort of scenario. And so now with service workers, we'll have a lot more control over that.
And some of the plugins we're talking about are just strictly performance things. So when we're talking like native page transitions or spinners or whatever, really the reason to use those plugins is familiarity with the native OS, which that's always going to be like no matter how fast the web is, there's always going to be some desire to mimic or to exactly use the native device's features. But if you're talking from a performance angle, it's just making the web fast enough so there is no jank associated with those type of transitions. And
Right.
just making browsers better, making phones better, making OSs better and faster. So I think that sort of thing will come in time. The web isn't getting any slower.
So,
At least
somewhat analogous to sort of plugins and innovations that are happening on the website. I'm probably it's funny when you talk to developers about web components, you get people who are viscerally pro and viscerally con when it comes to web components. I'm actually quite pro when it comes to web components. It's not so much a performance thing. It's more of I need some sanity around my markup, and I want to componentize the aspects of my web app or hybrid app, what have you. So I think Polymer is a great example of some. It's an opinionated sort of view on web components, but the innovations there are great. Things like Shadow DOM, HTML imports, and other things related to that are really going to help us in terms of that. Again, not strictly performance related, but will certainly help us stop the insanity around building web apps and hybrid apps.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up. Like I said, we will be giving away a Fire TV to one of the question askers. And if you check out our page, which is here at developer.telerik.com, you can find it through this community link is probably the easiest way. We'll announce who the winner is, and you can also check this page to find future episodes. So thank you, John. Thank you, Rob, for joining me today to chat about this. And like I said, feel free to check out this page to find out about future episodes. So thanks, guys, and I'll see y'all.
Thank you. Bye. Go back to bed, John.